reliability into further doubt, Pache Crook. Rather, these ideas bring the old discussion to a close, the end, and call for a new discussion, one that forestalls and leaves behind any talk of mixture or authenticity and inauthenticity and the criteria for distinguishing the two. So I'm going to offer 3 points. There are others, but in the interest of time, I'll just focus on these 3. First, historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. Let me say that again. Historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. At its core, Jesus' historiography is concerned with answering the question, did Jesus say or do such and such? In order to answer this question, historians examine sayings, events, complexes of tradition individually. Some historians elevate the isolation and decontextualization of individual traditions to programmatic status, and the results are not helpful. For example, one of Zeb's parents, the Jesus Seminar, narrowly decided to print Mark 2:17 in pink, their translation, since when do the able-bodied need a doctor? It's the sick who do. They describe the aphorism as a secular proverb, and they note a simpler parallel in Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1224. Despite their explicit goal of uncovering the distinctive voice of Jesus, quote, the fellows decided that the saying sounded like Jesus, although it did not originate with him, close quote. However, they learned nothing about Jesus in the process. Here, again, quote, the attribution of a proverbial remark to Jesus tells us nothing in particular about him, except that he may have been familiar with such sayings, close quote. Now, Jesus may have spoken the words that the seminar is printed in pink, perhaps even more than once, but these words tell us nothing about Jesus. The evangelists, however, do not simply report that Jesus said, those who are strong do not need a doctor, but rather those who are ill. The evangelists marshal these words in service of a particular interpretation of Jesus, that Jesus associated with sinners and tax collectors rather than with the scribes of the Pharisees, Mark 2:16. Without this interpretive agenda, we have no reason whatsoever for thinking that Mark or any other early Christian would have remembered Jesus uttering these words. The interpretation our authors give these words in our text explains why they were remembered and were attributed to Jesus in the first place. Oral historian Elizabeth Tonkin has complained about this approach to isolating facts apart from the narrative representation that gave those facts meaning. This is the quote that Zeb pulled. Professional historians who use the recollections of others cannot just scan them for useful facts to pick out like currants from a cake. Any such facts are so embedded in the representation that it directs an interpretation of them, and its very ordering, its plotting, and its metaphors bear meaning too. Close quote. It's a great quote. Similarly, Ann Schroeder rightly questions whether, quote, it is possible to have access to purely historical data behind their interpretation in the sources, close quote. In other words, Mark 2:17 provides a dramatic affirmation of Pruski's claim that, quote, the interpretations of the past themselves are what preserve any connection to the actual past, close quote. Historians will still have to determine how and whether this image relates to the actual events of Jesus' life, but we were never able to authenticate the words of Mark 2:17 apart from the context in which we find them. So as I said, historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. My second point, historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. We say it again, historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. Redaction critical research has dominated New Testament scholarship for over 5 decades. As a method, redaction criticism has thrown the creative work of the evangelists into particularly sharp relief. However, redaction criticism has also blinded us to certain historical questions the method is not well suited for answering or even asking. Scholars have long been aware of the danger of treating a gospel's distinctive features as its characteristic features, But a different problem arises when we apply redaction-critical methods of literary analysis to historical questions. And I'd like to turn to Luke's version of the Nazareth pericope to illustrate this problem. Redaction criticism enables us to note Luke's literary technique, whereby he's taken a story from a later narrative moment in his source, Mark 6, 1 through 6, moved to the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry, and then expanded it so that this pericope bears programmatic significance for the entire narrative of Luke Acts. In light of Luke's heavy redaction of Luke 4, historians have largely taken one of three tacks. First, some historians have simply dismissed the historical value of Luke's account altogether, since Luke has altered the story so dramatically. It speaks directly to Luke's interests and concerns toward the end of the first century, rather than the realities of Jesus' life closer to the beginning. Second, some have largely assumed that Luke's redaction accurately reflects the realities of Jesus' life. The argument generally goes that since Luke accurately describes the synagogue services in Galilee in the first century, it must also reflect accurately what happened in Jesus' life. And then the third tack is that some will suggest that Luke had access to a source other than Mark, and that Luke either preferred that source or he combined it with Mark. But all three of these approaches, I think, miss the point. The redaction-critical approach offers compelling explanations of Luke's production of an image of Jesus in the Nazareth synagogue, but it does not explain either why Luke should have wished to present this particular image, nor does it address why anyone should have accepted Luke's innovative presentation. American sociologist Barry Schwartz, who apparently is a member of the Trinity, cautions that a production of culture model, which we normally refer to as constructivism, neglects issues of reception, quote, which reflects those elements in the social environment that enhance public readiness to respond positively to entrepreneurs' claims, close quote. In other words, memory studies forefronts the question, why did Luke's redaction of the Nazareth pericope work? Anthony LaDunn, who's not published on Luke 4 specifically, offers a helpful model of thinking historically about Luke's redaction. LaDunn sets multiple interpretive trajectories alongside each other and pursues the set of historical circumstances that best explains all the data. I've written about the historical materials that enabled Luke's particular redaction of the Nazareth pericope, and the value that historians can find in Luke's pericope, and the ways that established images of Jesus constrain Luke's creativity in his presentation of the past. I want to emphasize this is an obviously distorted and manipulated passage. And Chris Keith has also focused on Luke's Nazareth pericope and the ways that Luke has reworked the reputation of Jesus in Mark and Matthew. Chris describes it there as a member of the manual labor class, and Luke has now positioned Jesus among the scribal educated class. In other words, memory studies has offered historians tools to reclaim Luke's Nazareth pericope as a source of historical information about Jesus, and it has done so without assuming uncritically that Luke simply retells what happened without any interpretive agenda. So my second point is historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. And here's my third and final point. Historians have to account for the single most obvious fact arising from the Jesus tradition. This is true of canonical and non-canonical Jesus. That fact is, whatever the details of his life, Jesus of Nazareth was a powerful and dynamic vehicle for his followers' memory. In structuring early Christian memory, I framed my historical analysis in terms of this very question. I asked, why Jesus? Why did Jesus' followers choose him as a vehicle to address and conquer their concerns? Now, certainly part of the answer must be that Jesus made an impression, or as Jimmy Dunn would say, an impact on those he encountered. And if so, we'll need to account for the ways that Jesus shaped his followers' perspective, the ways that they apprehended and responded to challenges in the present. Jesus is responsible for some of those ways, or at least something of those ways. In this sense, even traditions that do not actually go back to Jesus accurately reflect the Jesus of history. The creation of Jesus' tradition is guided by impulses that themselves go back to Jesus. And Dale Allison has excellent discussions of this in a number of places, especially his treatment of the temptation passages in Matthew and Luke, and Mark as well. However, just as Jesus' followers were defined by his impact on them, otherwise why would they speak about him so prolifically and to the neglect of other influential teachers? Just as Jesus' followers were defined by his impact on them, so also they actualized and utilized and interpreted their memories of Jesus in contexts that were not defined by him. The flip side of this question, why Jesus? Why did they choose him? The flip side of this question is that Jesus' followers always remembered him for their own reasons and in their own situations. We do not have to deny that they perceived Jesus' life and teachings as useful or appropriate for interpreting and responding to new situations like the gospel's diffusion into the diaspora, or the influx of Gentiles, or the destruction of the temple. We don't have to deny that they perceived Jesus as useful for these things, to recognize that Jesus' followers nevertheless recalled Jesus in and for their ever-shifting present. Barry Schwartz offers a model of keying, which helps us account for the function of Jesus as a vehicle of memory and a resource for interpreting new problems and orienting communities of Jesus' followers to those problems. And I'll quote him at length. Quote, "Keying defines social memory's function, matching the past to the present, one as a model of society, reflecting its needs, interests, fears, and aspirations. Two, a model for society, a template for thought, sentiment, morality, and conduct. And three, a frame within which people find meaning for their experience. Social memory affects the present not only by reflecting it, but also, and more importantly, by shaping and framing individual experience." Close quote. Schwartz's model respects and accounts for that two-way movement between the past and the present, what I've elsewhere described as the mutually constitutive dialectic between past and present. So, we cannot assume an easy continuity between the past and the present, but neither can we approach the past and present as fundamentally disjoined. Remembering Jesus was necessarily remembering in the present, but Jesus' followers lived in a present that was already orientated in terms of the past of which Jesus was a part. So when we ask why Jesus' followers could create and attribute traditions to Jesus, the answer can only be that Jesus already oriented his followers to their present circumstances. When they responded to new situations, even situations that Jesus himself never faced, they did so precisely as followers of Jesus. I'll close with some thoughts on history and memory in the Gospels. Robert Miller aptly described the dominant conception of the task facing historians of Jesus, at least since Romanes, a conception that has reigned through the 20th century and that arguably still holds sway today. That is, Miller imagines the Gospels like the fields of the man whose enemies sowed weeds among his good seed. The historian's task is to discern the wheat from the tares, to uproot the tares, and to restore the Jesus of history, free from the corrupting interpretations of those who followed him. However, as memory theorists have taught us to expect, and as Chris Keith has powerfully expressed, the authentic memory of Jesus has been preserved in our sources because his followers found him useful and worth remembering in their later contexts. Memory theory teaches us not only to look for the historical Jesus precisely in his followers' interpretations of him, but it also gives us tools for conducting that search. As professional historians, we may find ourselves discomfited by the fact that our ability to discern historical reality has to work through rather than around the memories of Jesus' followers if we hope to have any authentic connection with the Jesus of history, such as life. As Olick and Robbins explain, if experience is always embedded in and occurs through narrative frames, then there is no primal, unmediated experience that can be recovered. The distinction between history and memory in such accounts is a matter of disciplinary power rather than of epistemological prestige. Were it not for the interpretive work of his followers,